All right, so we're going to continue discussing Chapter 2, Neuroscience and Biological Functions. And now we'll start talking about the nervous system's organization. So our learning objectives is going to be how we are able to compare the different parts of the nervous system, that being the central nervous system with the peripheral nervous system. We're going to look at identifying the major elements of the nervous system. We'll be able to talk about, and hopefully you'll be able to explain the roles of the central nervous system, as well as being able to describe the different components that's associated with the peripheral nervous system. Now, let's take a look at this big picture. Have you ever heard the expression, information is power? Well, nowhere is this more true than within our bodies. Because without the information, we wouldn't be able to survive. Our neurons within the nervous system, it has sensory information that is gathering from the outside world, our environment outside, and it decides what really should it be done with in terms of information. Just as the circulatory system would take care of your blood, that allow chemicals and oxygen to be sent through it, our nervous system is going to be able to use different chemicals as well as electrical processes or action potentials that would help to convey that information. So our nervous system, understand, is divided into is divided as well as subdivided into several different branches. So the main branch, that's going to include your brain as well as a bundle of nerves that creates the spinal cord. Because with this system, it's located at the center of your body, and that's within your skull as well as your spine, that's the reason why it's called the central nervous system. Now, it's responsible for being able to process and organize the information given through those chemicals and electrical signals. The second major branch of your nervous system, this includes all those nerves that's outside the brain as well as your spinal cord. That's called the peripheral nervous system, and it carries messages, action potentials, and yes, I'm going to drive it in because I want you to remember that it is called an action potential. Those neural impulses are action potentials, so you need to keep that in mind because yes, it probably will show up as a test question. But as I was saying, it allows those messages to go to and from your central nervous system within to the periphery of your body. So we'll delve now deeper into looking at the central nervous system as well as the peripheral nervous system. Now, the central nervous system is that branch within the nervous system that makes us unique as a species. Most other animals, they can smell, they're able to see and hear, they're able to run much better than we can. Just the other day, my husband and I, we were looking at National Geographic, and they had a cheetah, and they talked about how the cheetah runs at least 60 miles within seconds. Now, we can't do that. But thanks to our central nervous system, we are able to process information as well as to adapt to our environment in ways no other species can. So the unfortunate thing, though, is that our central nervous system is extremely fragile. Unlike neurons that's going to be within the peripheral nervous system that can regenerate and require less protection, if there's any extreme damage to the neurons in the central nervous system, this is where it may be permanent, okay? And the probability is extremely high, unfortunately. However, the brain is not considered to be hardwired as it was considered historically. Now, when we're talking about the flexibility of the brain that's associated with the central nervous system, Our brain has the ability to make changes within structure and function in several different ways. The three main ways being listed as neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, and stem cells. So when we're talking about neuroplasticity, rather than it being a fixed, solid type of organ, here the brain is able to uh, make changes within the structure and function as a result of its usage as well as experiences. So that rewiring that we talked about during the Mythbusters, this is what makes our brain so adaptive. Okay, look at it this way. It kind of makes it possible for us to be able to learn a new sport or a foreign language or a new craft, a hobby, even learning this material that I'm conveying to you. Okay? So remarkably, this type of rewiring it allows us to be able to reshape or remodel our brain following different type of strokes. Okay? A stroke, excuse me. So Taub and colleagues, they was able to do research and they saw success working with stroke patients because of neuroplasticity. Okay. Now, in terms of neurogenesis and stem cells, neurogenesis is that division of differentiation of non-neuronal cells that's going to help produce those neurons. Our brains continually replace lost cells with new cells that originate deep within the brain, and then it migrates to be able to become part of the circuitry. So the source of these newly created cells is neural stem cells. Okay, it's rare immature cells that it has the ability to grow and develop into any type of cell. So you might have heard different news reports in which parents of newborn children request to have the stem cells that comes from the placenta saved and stored in case there's any problems or issues with their child, that they're able to take those stored stem cells and help recreate, like if there's issues with cancer or any type of medical illnesses in that fashion. They're able to take those stem cells and be able to replicate to help replace those that's damaged. Now, their fate do depend upon the chemical signals that are received. So stem cells, they, like I said, they've been able to help in terms of like bone marrow transplants, as well as been used in clinical trials that helps to repopulate or replace those cells that was devastated by any type of injury or disease. Okay, so one thing I do want to make mention that it has studies have been used for people who dealt with strokes, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, epilepsy, as well as stress and depression. So it can span far. Now, looking at how the spinal reflex works, the spinal cord is beginning at the base of your brain, okay? And then it continues down the back. Excuse me. So sorry. It continues down the back to the spinal cord. And what it does is it carries vital information from the rest of your body that goes into and out of the brain. But the spinal cord really isn't simply just relaying messages. What it is doing is initiating some automatic behaviors all on its own. Now, what we do is we label this and call this involuntary actions, and they're automatic behaviors, reflexes or reflex arcs, because the response to this incoming stimuli is going to be happening automatically and reflected back. We're all born with numerous types of reflexes, many of which fades over time. But even when we become adults, we still blink in response to if somebody blew air into our eyes. We may gag or cough like right now, throat's dry. So it's an automatic response that I start trying to clear my throat, okay? As well as a process of elimination in terms of urinating and defecating. This comes from a response to pressure in our bladder as well as the rectum. So reflexes, they help our body in terms of keeping us fresh and clean, so to speak, as eliminating those wastes. It allows us also in terms of our sexual responses. There's reflexes that influences those as well. Because the thing is, there's certain stimuli, like the stroking of the genitals, that would lead to arousal, as well as reflexive muscle contractions that would help to create an orgasm, which is in both men and women. However, when we're talking about this, in order for us to have passion and thoughts and emotions that's normally associated with sex, that sensory information from the stroking and orgasm has to be carried back to the brain. Okay, the brain need to know what's going on pretty much at all times for our body to react appropriately. So, talking about the peripheral nervous system, now we're talking about how it's connecting the central nervous system to the body. And the peripheral nervous system in and of itself is broken into subdivisions, okay? That being the somatic nervous system, which deals with voluntary, and then the autonomic nervous system, which is involuntary, okay? Let's talk about the somatic nervous system first. This subdivision of the peripheral nervous system, it connects to sensory receptors and it controls our skeletal muscles. Okay, so what it does is it's going to be helping as far as muscle contraction, helping us in our ability for mobility and movement, like when we want to move our hands and so forth. That's what it would help us with. But the autonomic nervous system, remember I said it's involuntary. It helps us in far more ways that's uh, really, we don't think about it as being automatic, but it is. This subdivision of the peripheral nervous system involves involuntary functions such as heart rate, as well as our digestive systems. It helps to it further subdivide into two more set of groups, which is the sympathetic nervous system, which with the sympathetic nervous system, that's the arouser, okay? Think of the parasympathetic nervous system as calming, all right? So with the sympathetic nervous system, this subdivision of the autonomic nervous system, and I know it can get confusing, but utilize this chart on this slide and it helps keep it all in mind for you. With the sympathetic nervous system, again, the subdivision of the autonomic nervous system. It's again responsible for our bodies being able to be aroused in terms of being able to mobilize energy, helps us in times of stress. It's got this, if you ever heard of the term fight or flight, it is in response to the sympathetic nervous system. So I want you to remember fight or flight, sympathetic nervous system, okay? Because the sympathetic nervous system is going to help in terms of if a snake, if you was to come up against a snake, sometimes we have two things that our mind is going to help us understand and know. Do we run or do we fight it off? Okay? For the most of us, it's going to be flight. For the most of us. But then you have some people daring and they actually go into fight mode. That is sympathetic nervous system is responsible for those type of situations. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system, here this is responsible for our body being able to get calmed. It helps to conserve energy and so forth. Now, when we talk again about the sympathetic nervous system, remember, it provides an adaptive evolutionary advantage for us. At the beginning of evolution for humans, we were faced with danger, okay? That being, it can be animals like bears or even if someone who was being aggressive and violent toward us. There were only two reasonable responses, that fight or flight. So that automatic mobilization of bodily resources is very critical even today because, I hate to say it, we still have aggressive, violent forces sometimes that's presented to us. Or even not, if we're not talking about violence, let's talk about, just say you were crossing the street and out of nowhere, out of the blue, you see a car coming toward you. Well, that fight or flight is going to either help save your life, or if you're like a deer with your eyes caught in the headlights and you move still, don't move, you're going to get hit by the car. Okay? That's what the sympathetic nervous system is going to be responsible for. However, less life-threatening events like traffic jams or um, other things on that nature can also activate our sympathetic nervous system. Just think of it as your survival kick, okay? Our bodies are still going to be able to respond to those different sources of stress with the sympathetic arousal. And as we go further into the textbook, you'll be able to see just how the sympathetic system helps us with our stress, because we have a whole chapter on stress, and how actually if we utilize the sympathetic nervous system too much, it actually can be detrimental to our health. So, but we'll talk more about that later. So let's take a tour of the brain. We're going to look at the brain as a whole, and get a good picture of it. As we begin our exploration of the brain, let's start at that lower end where that spinal cord joins the base of the brain. So now take a look and move up through the skull. As we're going from bottom to the top and then lower, those basic processes like our ability to breathe generally give way to more complex mental processes as we move further up. So the lower level brain structures. Here the brain size and complexity vary significantly from one species to the next. So for an example, when we talk about fish and reptiles, they have smaller, less complex brains than cats and dogs. The most complex brains, again, as mentioned earlier, were dolphins and whales, as well as higher primates like chimps and gorillas and humans. The billions of neurons that make up the human brain control much of how we think and feel and our ability to do things. Certain brain structures are specialized to be able to perform specific tasks, and this process is known as localization of function. However, most parts of the brain is going to perform through integration, and generally speaking, the different tasks often overlaps one another. Now, I want you to just listen, which is what you've been doing, I know. But you are deep in REM sleep. As you begin your last dream of the night, your vital signs as the dream gets more exciting. But then you're asleep and you start to dream. And then it's shattered by a buzzing alarm clock. All of a sudden, that alarm clock goes ding, 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 or whatever chime you use on your smartphone, because the majority of us uses our smartphone today. All of your automatic behaviors and survival responses in this scenario will be controlled or influenced from your hindbrain. The hindbrain includes the medulla, your pons, as well as the cerebellum. Now, the medulla is essentially going to be an extension of the spinal cord, and it has a lot of different nerve fibers that passes through, and what it does is it carries information to and from the brain. It's also responsible for controlling those essential automatic bodily functions like respiration and your heart rate. The next thing would be pons, and here this is involved again with respiration, but it also has some responsibilities in terms of your movement as well as sleeping, how you waken as well as dreaming, among other things that I mean, the list can go a little further, but those are the main things I want you to know. It also helps, though, to know that it contains axons that crosses from one side of the brain to the other. So think of when you're saying pons, if you looked at the Latin definition, it means bridge. The pons bridges those items together in order for you to function. Now, if you was to look back at the last slide, there's a cauliflower shaped item in your brain, and it's called the cerebellum. In Latin, that stands for little brain. Here, this is an evolutionary, very old structure. Okay, what it does is it coordinates fine muscle movement as well as your ability to be balanced, or your equilibrium, so to speak. Researchers using functional magnetic resonance imaging, the fMRI, have been able to show parts of the cerebellum that's also important for your memory, sensory, some perceptual, cognitive, language, and learning abilities. Now, we've moved up toward the midbrain. And the midbrain, what it does is helps us to be oriented in terms of our eyes and body coordination, movements, for visual and auditory stimuli. And it then also works along with the pons to help in controlling your sleep as well as level of arousal. It also contains a small structure that's involved with the neurotransmitter dopamine. And now, remember, in the dopamine hypothesis, here we talk about too much or too little. In terms of deterioration in Parkinson's disease, it's a big factor. Running through the core of the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the brainstem is what is called the reticular formation. This diffuse finger-shaped network of neurons will help in screen incoming sensory information. It is going to help in alerting the higher brain centers to very important events. Think of it this way. Without your reticular formation, you would not be alert or even conscious. You won't be conscious. Now, the forebrain. The forebrain has four particular sections: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the limbic system, and the cerebral cortex. Within the thalamus, this part of the structure is at the top of the brainstem, and it serves the brain as, think of a switchboard that relays sensory messages to the cerebral cortex. The hypothalamus is a small brain structure that's going to be beneath the thalamus, and it helps to, it's kind of responsible for your drives, that being hunger, thirst, sex, as well as aggression. And it also is responsible for your hormones. Now, the limbic system is interconnected group of structures that's involved with your emotions, your drives, as well as your memory. So you can see all this overlapping, but each of them have specific responsibilities for those sections. The cerebral cortex, now this is that thin surface layer on the cerebral hemispheres that regulates most of your complex behaviors, which includes sensations, your motor control, as well as high mental processing. And although the cerebral cortex is about 1/8 of an inch thick, it's made up of approximately 30 billion neurons, and it's 9 times that as many glial cells. It contains numerous wrinkles, which is called convolutions, and this increases the surface area while allowing it to fit in the restricted space of your skull. The full cerebral cortex, as well as the 2 cerebral hemispheres beneath it, is closely resembled an oversized walnut. And that division or fissure down the center is going to help to mark the left and right hemispheres of the brain, which this makes up about 80% of the brain's weight. So It's mostly filled with axon connections that's going to be between the cortex as well as other brain structures. And each hemisphere controls the opposite side of the body. So, for example, if you was to raise your left hand in the class, pretty much your right hemisphere is responsible for your left hand being raised. Now, speaking of the limbic system, it's generally going to be responsible, as I mentioned, for your emotions, your drives, as well as your memory. However, the major focus of the limbic system, particularly the amygdala, which is, has been its production and regulation for aggression and fears. The hypothalamus is that, again, the small structure beneath the thalamus, and it helps govern those drives of hunger, thirst, sex, and aggression. And the hippocampus will be responsible for forming and retrieving your memories. That amygdala, again, is going to help in terms of those emotions of aggression and fear. And although the limbic system structures and neurotransmitters are instrumental with emotions, the frontal lobes of the cortex is also a key component and plays an important role. Now, major functions of the lobes of the brain includes our frontal lobes and the parietal lobes. Frontal lobes, the two lobes at the front of the brain that governs your motor controls, the motor cortex, as well as speech production within the left lobe, and that's also called the Broca's area, as well as I call it the executor because it also deals with higher functions such as your ability to think, how your personality is constructed, your emotions and your memories. Pretty much the cerebral hemispheres, they're divided into 8 distinct areas or lobes, and the 4 frontal lobes is just one set of those 8. So 4 within each hemisphere, and like the lower level brain structures, each lobe has that specialization and is responsible for different tasks. Another example of that localization of functioning that I mentioned earlier. However, some functions do overlap again, just like I mentioned earlier, there's an overlap of responsibility within the lobes as well. So just to repeat, the larger, the frontal lobes is going to coordinate messages, and it's going to take those as the executor is going to receive and send messages to the other 3 lobes. So an area at the very back of the frontal lobes is known as the motor cortex. And basically it's instigating all the voluntary movements you have, like raising that hand. In the lower left frontal lobe lies again the Broca's area. So let me tell you a little bit about Paul Broca. He, in 1865, discovered that damage to this area actually would cause difficulties with one's speech, but not their language comprehension. So more or less, this type of impaired language ability is what we call Broca's aphasia. Final thing about the frontal lobes is the controlled most higher functioning helps to distinguish humans from animals, such as our ability to think, again, how our personality is constructed, our emotions and memories. Any type of abnormalities within the frontal lobes are often observed with patients that has schizophrenia. And then there's been other research that indicates that damage to the frontal lobe actually can affect how our personality is, our level of motivation, our drives, the ability to create, being self-aware, are we innovative or take initiative, our abilities for reasoning as well as our emotional behaviors. Now the parietal lobes, they receive and interpret bodily sensations, which includes our pressure, pain, touch, temperature, as well as the location of our limbs, our body parts. Now within it, there's a band of tissue on the front of the parietal lobe, which is called the somatosensory cortex. And basically, this receives information about our touch in different body areas. Areas of the body with more somatosensory and motor cortex devoted to them, like our hands and face. And it's more sensitive to the touch and be able to have more precise motor control because of the parietal lobes. Now moving further in, let's talk about the temporal lobes. Here the responsibility is going to be for hearing, language comprehension, memory, as well as some emotional control. The auditory cortex, which is helps to process our ability to hear the sound, is located at the top front of each temporal lobe. This area processes incoming sensory information and it sends it to the parietal lobes, which combines with other sensory information. Now, an area of the left temporal lobe specifically is what we call the Wernicke's area. And this is involved with our language comprehension. So maybe about a decade after Broca discovered the Broca's aphasia, Carl Wernicke, he was one who found out and learned how damage to that area would be, where a person's ability to speak is okay, but they don't understand what's being said, or if they're reading, they're not able to comprehend it in that aspect either. But they're able to speak quickly and easily. So, however, the speech was often not intelligible because it contained made-up words, like a word salad. They used substitutions of sounds and words. So this particular syndrome is what's called Wernicke's aphasia. Now let's move on to occipital lobes. This is responsible for other things that includes our vision as well as our visual perceptions. And damage to the occipital lobe can produce blindness, even if the eyes and their neural connections to the brain are perfectly healthy. If there's damage there, you still may have blindness. Association areas. Now, this is one of the more popular myths in psychology is that we only use that 10% of our brains. If you remember, we talked about that in the beginning of the chapter. Why is this a myth? This myth, it began with early research that shows that approximately 3/4 of the cortex is uncommitted. And when I say uncommitted, that's saying that there's no precise specific function that's responsible for electrical brain stimulation. But these areas it doesn't mean they're not active. They're not dormant. They're just clearly involved with interpreting and integrating as well as acting on information that's processed by the other parts of the brain. So simply put, they're called associations because they associate or connect to the various other parts of the brain. And that association area could include the frontal lobe, for example, which helps with our abilities for problem solving as well as being able to strategize and plan things out. Same holds true that the association area can help in terms of the motor cortex, which helps with planning voluntary movements. So, as I said before, we use much more than 10% of our brains, but because there's no specific labeling of exactly what the association areas do, then that's why people felt that that was a dormant area, but in reality, it's not. All right. So visualizing our motor and sensory cortex. This wonderful graphic kind of shows where in the brain is doing for what our body needs in terms of our left motor cortex and then the right somatosensory cortex. Sensory cortex, excuse me. So this illustration shows that vertical cross-section that's taken from the left hemisphere motor cortex to the right hemisphere somatosensory cortex. If body areas were truly proportional to the amount of tissue on the motor and somatosensory cortexes, our bodies would look like rubber bands, basically, these odd-shaped figures that would drape around the outside of the cortex. But it does allow you to see just how we work, how our bodies work, and how it communicates throughout. All right, so let's talk a little bit about split brain research. The primary connection between the two cerebral hemispheres is this thick ribbon-like band of nerve fibers that's under the cortex, which is called the corpus callosum. In some rare cases, like of severe epilepsy, and there's other forms of treatment had failed, what happened was surgeons would cut the corpus callosum to stop the spread of epileptic seizures from one hemisphere to the other. Because this operation cuts the only direct communication link between the two hemispheres, what happened was it showed that each half of the brain can do in isolation from the other. That result was profoundly showing to improve our understanding of how the two halves of the brains function. And pretty much, although there's one part, it will adapt to work with other parts, but each do have its own responsibilities. Finally, this is the last slide. As you can see, our eyes connect to our brains in such a way that when we look straight ahead, information from the left visual field, and on the if you look at the graphic, that's the blue line, would travel to our right hemisphere. And the information from the right visual field, the red line, is going to travel to our left. These messages will be received by either hemisphere are then quickly sent to the other across the corpus callosum. All right. With that being said, this is the final this is the final part to chapter 2. Please go ahead and get started on reading chapter 3. Of course, there will be an assignment attached to this, and have a great one. Thanks for listening.